I was 34 years old when the temperature dropped to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit in that valley near the Beartooth Mountains, and I had exactly 36 hours before the storm would trap me completely. No tent, no sleeping bag rated below minus 20. Nothing but my axe, a shovel, and a technique I'd read about once in an old book from 1887 that nobody used anymore. The wind was pushing at 58 miles per hour, and the visibility had dropped to maybe 15 feet. I remember thinking, standing there with snow already gathering on my shoulders, that everyone who came to these mountains in winter did the same thing. They built fires above ground, kept them going all night, burned through half a cord of wood, and still froze if the weather turned. That January night in 1962, I decided to do something different. And that decision, that single choice to try a method most trappers had abandoned 50 years earlier, probably saved my life. I grew up in the Appalachian foothills where my grandfather trapped bear and lynx back in the 1920s. By the time I was 16, I'd already spent 4 winters in the mountains, and I thought I knew everything about keeping warm in extreme conditions. I was wrong. The standard method was simple. You dig a pit about 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, build your fire right at ground level, and sleep on a raised platform about 2 feet above the flames. The idea was that the heat would radiate upward all night. I tried this method dozens of times between 1948 and 1960, and every single time I woke up either freezing because the fire had died down to embers, or half roasted on one side and frozen on the other. The math was brutal. A typical fire running through the night consumes roughly 40 to 60 pounds of wood depending on wood density and moisture content. And that fire only generates effective heat in a radius of about 8 feet. I was losing maybe 30% of that heat to the wind and the open sky. On one particularly bad night in 1959, the temperature was minus 28 degrees, and I burned through 72 pounds of wood and still nearly got frostbite on my left foot. That's when I knew the standard method wasn't going to work for me anymore, especially as I was planning longer and longer expeditions deeper into the wilderness. If you like this kind of practical knowledge that can save your life, subscribe to the channel. I post a new survival technique every week, all tested by me during 40 years in the wilderness. All right, now let's get to what matters. I found the technique buried in an old leather-bound book called Frontier Methods of the Mountain Men, published in 1887. The author was a man named Samuel Hutchins, who'd trapped in the Rockies from 1851 to 1876. Hutchins described something called a coal bed shelter, and he claimed that trappers and native peoples in the Arctic regions had been using it for at least 200 years before it fell out of fashion. The technique was essentially forgotten by the early 1900s because portable stoves and improved tents had become available. But Hutchins included specific measurements and ratios that intrigued me. He said that using charcoal and partially burned coal instead of fresh wood created a heat source that lasted longer, radiated more evenly, and, crucially, required less active management. I became obsessed with understanding how this actually worked. I spent that entire spring and summer of 1961 experimenting with different types of coal, different depths, different configurations. I read everything I could find about heat transfer. I even corresponded with a professor at the University of Montana who specialized in thermodynamics. He explained to me that charcoal has a much higher heat density than wood, about 14,500 BTU per pound compared to 8,000 for seasoned wood, and that the secret was in the way the coal would burn gradually and completely, creating a sustained, even temperature rather than the up and down cycle of a wood fire. I also spent weeks talking with an old Crow Nation elder named Running Bear who lived about 40 miles from my base camp. Running Bear was in his 80s at that time, and he remembered his grandmother teaching him techniques from even before the reservation era. He'd never called it a coal bed, but he described something nearly identical, a method using mineral charcoal collected from ancient burn sites, mixed with soil and specific clay types, to create a heating mass that could warm a shelter through entire winters. He told me that his people used to heat rocks to about 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit and nestle them into this charcoal base, and the combined mass would maintain warmth for 18 to 24 hours before needing refresh. Running Bear showed me how to identify the right clay, a reddish clay with high iron content that could withstand repeated heating without cracking. He taught me the ratio was approximately 60% charcoal, 25% clay, and 15% binding materials like plant fibers. When I asked him why his people didn't use this method anymore, he just smiled and said, "We did until we didn't have to. Now you need to remember." And that January night in 1962, I had 2 days to prepare before the real storm hit. I spent the first day collecting materials. I found a seam of anthracite coal about 3 miles from where I'd set up my base camp. Anthracite burns much hotter and cleaner than bituminous coal, and I needed about 180 pounds of it. The coal pieces I selected were between 2 and 4 inches in diameter, large enough to burn for extended periods, but small enough to pack density into my structure. I dug and gathered for 6 hours straight, filling 3 canvas bags. Then I needed the clay. I walked another 2 miles until I found exposed earth near a dried creek bed that had the right color and texture, that reddish iron-rich clay that Running Bear had showed me how to identify. I could test it by feeling the grittiness. The good clay had a specific texture, almost like fine sandpaper. I collected about 120 pounds of this clay, which I knew would be heavy but necessary for the binding and heat retention properties. For additional binding material, I gathered dried grass and bark fiber from dead birch trees. The bark had to be stripped from fallen trees, not fresh timber, and I collected about 8 pounds of it. I also prepared 45 pounds of rocks, specifically river stones about the size of a man's fist. These stones needed to be completely dry. Any moisture inside them could cause them to explode when heated. So I'd been keeping them near my fire for 3 days before the storm came, bringing their internal temperature up to approximately 180 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure all moisture was driven out. The first major change from the standard fire pit method was the construction of the containment structure itself. Instead of a simple pit, I dug a chamber that was 5 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. The walls needed to be angled slightly inward at about an 8-degree angle, which helped direct heat upward and prevented collapse. I spent 4 hours on just this digging. Because the soil was partially frozen, it was maybe 28 degrees that morning, and every shovel stroke took real effort. The depth was critical because I needed to create an insulating layer of soil between my coal bed and the frozen earth below. Frozen ground conducts coaled directly upward, so that 3-foot depth ensured at least 18 inches of unfrozen earth between my heat source and the permafrost below. I also dug 2 small channels about 4 inches wide and 18 inches long that ran from the main chamber to the outside. These were critical for ventilation. The coal needed oxygen to burn properly, and without these channels, the coal would smolder and produce dangerous carbon monoxide levels. I tested these channels by holding a piece of burning bark near each one. The smoke should drift outward smoothly, and it did. That told me the airflow was correct. The second major change involved the layering system, which was completely different from a standard fire. On the bottom of the pit, I laid down 6 inches of clay charcoal mixture. This wasn't pure charcoal. It was the mixture that Running Bear had taught me. 60% charcoal by weight, 25% clay, and 15% bark fiber bound together. I mixed this by hand on a tarp, working it with my fingers until it held together like wet sand. This base layer served as both a heat source and a radiator. Above this base layer, I placed the 45 river stones I'd prepared, arranging them carefully so they were in contact with the clay charcoal mixture below, but not crushing it. The stones needed to be touching each other with minimal gaps. I spent 45 minutes just arranging these stones, trying different configurations until I found an arrangement where every stone was supported and the heat could flow through the entire mass evenly. The spaces between the stones were then filled with another 4 inches of the clay charcoal mixture. This created a sandwich effect, heat source at the bottom, conducting through stones, heat source at the top, all contained in that clay matrix. The third major change was the shelter structure built directly above this coal bed. Standard fire methods had you sleeping 2 feet above the flames, exposed to the wind and losing heat to the open sky. Instead, I built a box-like structure directly over my coal bed using branches and insulation materials. The box was 5 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high at the peak. I used poles about 2 inches in diameter, lashed together with dried roots and plant fiber cordage I'd prepared weeks earlier. These branches I lashed so tightly that there were no visible gaps. The tension had to be tight enough that when I pressed on the structure with my full weight, it didn't flex more than a 1/4 inch. Then I layered pine boughs, fresh pine boughs, still flexible, about 8 inches thick, across the roof structure. Pine boughs don't conduct cold, and they create a surprisingly effective insulation layer. I layered them the way you'd shingle a roof, with each layer overlapping the layer beneath it. Over these pine boughs, I draped a leather tarp that I'd treated with rendered animal fat. This waterproofing was essential because the snow and melting moisture from the coal bed would accumulate, and moisture inside the shelter means rapid heat loss. The total weight of this structure was probably 280 to 300 pounds, but that weight was distributed across the pit walls, not on me. The fourth element addressed the critical issue of proximity to the heat source without being too close. With a traditional fire, you have to worry about catching your clothes or sleeping skins on fire, and you also have to worry about carbon monoxide if the fire is too close in a confined space. I installed a platform made from branches, woven together and elevated exactly 22 inches above the top layer of my coal bed. This 22-inch measurement was specific. At 18 inches, the heat becomes almost unbearably intense. I tested this with my hand and could only hold it there for about 3 seconds before the heat became painful. At 28 inches, I could feel the temperature drop significantly. At 22 inches, I could keep my hand there for 15 to 20 seconds comfortably, which meant the radiant heat was strong but not dangerous. The platform itself was made from ash wood branches, because ash wood doesn't conduct heat as quickly as other woods. I wove these branches by hand, creating a lattice that would support my weight. I'm 180 pounds, but also allow air circulation underneath. I wanted my body to receive heat from below, not to be insulated from it by a solid platform. The fifth element involved a sophisticated air management system that I'd never seen described in any traditional method, but which I'd developed through trial and error that fall. Inside my shelter box, running along the top interior edge, I cut 8 small openings, each about 2 inches in diameter. These openings had caps made from pieces of leather attached with leather strips. I could open or close these vents from inside my shelter by reaching up and adjusting the flaps. These vents served 3 purposes. First, they allowed me to control the temperature inside the shelter. If it got too hot, I opened more vents and warm air would escape. Second, they prevented moisture buildup. The coal bed creates some moisture as it burns, and that moisture would condense on my body otherwise. By opening these vents, I could maintain a humidity level inside the shelter that felt comfortable, roughly 40 to 50%. I could assess humidity by how my skin felt and whether condensation was forming on the inside of my tarp roof. Third, they gave me a way to keep the coal burning evenly. If I felt the heat dropping on one side of the shelter, I could close vents on that side to encourage heat buildup or open vents on the warm side to redistribute. I had these vents positioned to mirror the layout of the coal bed below, 4 vents over the main coal mass and 4 over the stone layer. This wasn't random. It was based on my understanding of where the heat would be most intense. I lit the coal bed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on January 14th, 1962. The process of igniting coal is different from wood because coal needs sustained, intense heat to begin burning. I used a fire starter made from birch bark. I'd collected about 2 pounds of dried birch bark and kindling wood that I'd prepared weeks earlier. I built a small wood fire in the center of my clay charcoal mixture, and once it was going strong, after about 20 minutes, I began adding pieces of the anthracite coal directly to the flames. The coal doesn't ignite quickly. Each piece took 3 to 5 minutes of being exposed to flame before it began to glow. Once it did glow, though, it would burn steadily. I added coal systematically, working outward from the center in a spiral pattern, until the entire base layer was glowing with that characteristic deep red that means the coal is burning at about 1200 to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. Once all the base coal was burning, I carefully placed the preheated river stones on top of it. And then I covered the stones with the upper layer of clay charcoal mixture and coal. I covered the top with a final layer of clay to seal it. This sealing was important because it slowed the burn rate. The coal underneath would glow for hours without producing flames or smoke on the surface. The storm actually arrived earlier than predicted. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wind was already pushing 48 miles per hour, and the snow was coming in waves. By 8 o'clock, the visibility was essentially zero. I couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. I sealed myself into my shelter at 8:15 that evening. I took one final temperature reading with a mercury thermometer, and it read -38 degrees Fahrenheit outside the shelter. I sealed the leather tarp flaps shut, left only 2 of my 8 vents open at about quarter way, and settled onto my prepared sleeping furs. I'd made a bed of 3 layers. The bottom was pine boughs that I'd piled 8 inches thick. The middle was furs from animals I'd trapped and prepared over the previous 3 months. 3 fox furs and 2 beaver furs, giving me about 12 pounds of insulation and 14 square feet of coverage. And the top layer was a wool blanket and leather hide that I could wrap around myself. When I lay down on this bed, my body was approximately 22 inches above the top of my coal bed, positioned right over the main heat mass. The first 4 hours were about validation. I was awake, monitoring everything, checking temperatures, adjusting vents, making sure nothing was going wrong. At 9 o'clock, I measured the temperature inside the shelter at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. At 10 o'clock, it was 62 degrees. At midnight, it had climbed to 71 degrees and had stabilized. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -44 degrees. The temperature difference of 115 degrees Fahrenheit is significant. It means the system was working. I could hear the wind outside, sometimes hitting the shelter with gusts that made the whole structure move slightly. But inside there was no wind, no drafts. The humidity level felt right. I wasn't sweating, but I wasn't dry either. My breathing wasn't creating condensation clouds like it normally would in a cold shelter. At 2 in the morning, I adjusted one vent closed and opened the other one more fully just to see how the system responded. The temperature dropped about 3 degrees over 10 minutes, confirming that the vents did indeed give me control. I closed that vent back down and the temperature climbed back up within 15 minutes. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I'd been in the shelter for 9.75 hours. I measured the outside temperature at -41 degrees. The inside temperature had actually climbed slightly to 74 degrees. The coal bed was still burning steadily. I could see the glow on the surface layer, and I could feel the consistent heat. I'd adjusted the vents only twice more during the night, and both times the system had responded exactly as I expected. My clothing was still completely dry. The furs and wool I was lying on weren't damp at all, but more importantly, I was warm. Not hot, but genuinely, consistently warm. I could move my fingers and toes without pain. I'd brought dried meat, berries, and water. The water had stayed just above freezing in an insulated bag next to me, and I ate some breakfast at 7 in the morning. The real test came during the second night. The coal bed was still producing heat, but I could tell the burn rate was slowing. The visible glow on the surface was less intense than it had been. The temperature inside the shelter had dropped to 67 degrees by 6 o'clock in the evening. I knew the coal bed would eventually need refueling, but I was curious about how long it would last. Samuel Hutchins had written in his 1887 book that a properly constructed coal bed would sustain heat for 24 to 36 hours, depending on the quality of coal and the ambient temperature. Hutchins had been dealing with -20 to -30 degree weather typically. I was in -40 to -45 degree conditions. At 7 o'clock that evening, the temperature outside had dropped to -43 degrees. Inside, the temperature was still 67 degrees, At midnight, it was 64 degrees inside and minus 45 degrees outside, still maintaining a 109-degree differential. At 3 in the morning on day 2, the inside temperature had dropped to 59 degrees, and the outside temperature was minus 47 degrees. The coal bed was still functioning, but clearly burning much more slowly now. I waited until 6 in the evening of day 2, 36 hours from ignition, before I decided to add fresh coal. At that point, the inside temperature was down to 53 degrees, which was still 100 degrees warmer than outside, but I could tell the system was reaching its limit. I opened the sealed surface layer carefully, and I could see that the coal had burned down substantially. The depth of the burning coal layer had gone from about 8 inches to about 3 inches. The stones in the middle were still hot. I could feel the heat radiating from them without touching them, and the bottom layer of the coal bed still had visible glow. I added fresh anthracite coal, layering it the same way I had originally, taking about 45 minutes to add approximately 90 pounds of fresh coal, roughly half of what I'd used in the initial lighting. I then resealed the top layer. Within 1 hour, the inside temperature had climbed back to 68 degrees. Within 3 hours, it was back to 72 degrees. The system was renewed. I stayed in that shelter for 82 hours total, from 4 o'clock on January 14th until 10 o'clock on the morning of January 17th. The storm began to break around 8 o'clock on the morning of the 17th. The wind dropped to 22 miles per hour, and the snow stopped. The visibility improved to maybe 150 feet. By 10 o'clock, I could see the sun briefly through the clouds. I sealed up my shelter. I allowed the coal to finish burning without adding new fuel, which took about 8 hours to completely extinguish, and I prepared to exit. When I did leave, 90 hours after ignition, the coal bed had completely finished burning. The rocks were still warm to the touch, probably around 150 to 160 degrees, but no longer burning. The clay had hardened into an almost ceramic-like mass. The entire structure had operated for 90 hours on a single initialization and 1 refueling at the 36-hour mark. The comparison between this coal bed method and the traditional fire pit method I'd been using for the previous 14 years was stark. The traditional method required me to maintain an active fire all night, staying partly awake to feed it, burning through 40 to 60 pounds of wood every 6 to 8 hours, keeping me at a temperature of around 55 to 65 degrees on a good night, often 48 to 55 degrees if the wind picked up, and limiting my ability to sleep because I had to keep an eye on the fire to prevent it from going out completely. The coal bed method required me to light it once, make minimal adjustments via the vents, allowed continuous sleep after the first check-in period, consumed coal much more slowly, roughly 40 pounds per 12 hours compared to wood's 40 to 60 per 6 to 8 hours, and maintained a consistent 68 to 74 degree temperature range regardless of outside conditions. The number of times I woke up due to cold discomfort was 0. The number of times I'd been woken up on previous expeditions due to cold was typically 4 to 6 times per night. The efficiency improvement wasn't just significant, it was transformative. I used this coal bed method consistently throughout the remainder of the 1960s and into the 1970s whenever I was doing extended winter camping alone. I built perhaps 35 to 40 of these shelters over a 15-year period. I experimented with variations, smaller coal beds for shorter trips, larger ones for base camps where I'd stay 10 to 15 days at a time. I refined the materials based on what was locally available in different regions, using different types of clay depending on the geography, adjusting rock sizes based on what I could find, sometimes substituting charcoal from my own fires for mined coal when I was far from coal seams. But the basic principle never changed, and the results were always consistent. In 1974, I was using this method during a research trip in the Brooks Range in Alaska, where temperatures dropped to minus 62 degrees Fahrenheit. My coal bed maintained inside temperatures of 68 to 72 degrees for 58 consecutive hours without any active management once it was lit. That's a 130-degree temperature differential maintained passively. In the modern era, sure, you can buy a gasoline camp stove for $150 to $200, And you can buy a minus 40-degree rated sleeping bag for $400 to $600. Those are tremendous tools, and I use them myself when I'm taking groups out. But the coal bed method offers something that modern equipment doesn't always provide. It works with materials you can find almost anywhere there's been industrial activity or natural coal deposits. It requires no external fuel supply. It doesn't require batteries or complex mechanics, and it teaches you something fundamental about heat transfer and material properties that makes you a better wilderness traveler regardless of what other tools you have. More than that, it's a connection to a method that worked for indigenous peoples and frontier trappers for centuries. A method that nearly disappeared, but that I'm glad I rediscovered. I spent 40 years in that wilderness, and I learned thousands of techniques, solutions to hundreds of problems. But the coal bed shelter might be in my top 5 methods for sheer usefulness and reliability. It solved the core problem that had plagued me for years: how to stay warm through extended extreme cold without constant active management. That night in 1962, when I sealed myself into that shelter and felt the consistent, even warmth spreading across my body, I knew I'd discovered something that would change how I traveled in winter. And it did. Look, I spent 40 years learning these techniques the hardest way possible, alone, in the cold, making mistakes that almost cost me my life. My goal with this channel is to give you all that knowledge without you having to go through what I went through. If you want to learn more techniques like this, things that really work when you need them most, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Leave a like if this video was useful, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where a technique like this would have saved you? And if you want to see another technique that saved me even more times, click on the video that will appear on screen. It's about building a winter shelter in deep snow using nothing but branches and ice. Remember that this channel presents fictional stories for educational purposes, with production assisted by artificial intelligence. See you next time, and stay safe out there.